Haglund is an artist whose work spans image making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, and other disciplines. Haglund's work has been featured in numerous exhibitions, and he's the author of 5 books and numerous articles on subjects including experimental geography, state security, military, symbology, photography, and visuality. Haglund's work has been profiled in the New York Times, Vice Magazine, the New Yorker, and Art Forum. In 2014, he received the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award for his work as a groundbreaking investigative artist. Haglund holds a BA from UC Berkeley, an MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago, and a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley. Joe Masco is professor of anthropology and the social sciences in the college here at the University of Chicago. He writes on science and technology, US national security, culture, political ecology, mass media, and critical theory. He is the author of The Nuclear Borderlands, The Manhattan Project, and Post-Cold War New Mexico, which won the 2008 Rachel Carson Prize from the Society for the Social Studies of Science and the 2006 Robert K. Merton Prize from the section on Science, Knowledge, and Technology of the American Sociology Association. His latest book is titled The Theater of Operations, National Security Affect from the Cold War to the War on Terror, and it examines the evolution of the national security state in the United States with a particular focus on the interplay between affect technology and threat perception within a national public sphere. Please join me in welcoming Trevor and Joe as they speak on global surveillance and the national security state.
I thought you wanted to run for it.
Well, I know I wanted to, sorry, let's see what time it is.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about how we might like to structure this conversation, and we thought that we have the great privilege of having Trevor on campus, that he could present a little bit about some of his latest projects, and then we'll have a conversation after that.
Sounds like a plan.
Good.
Thank you guys. Oh, wait, I can do that on here. Is that on? Is that on? Oh, okay, here we are. Thank you guys all so much for coming, and thank you so much for inviting me here. Like, it's such a treat to come to the University of Chicago. Such a treat to be in conversation with Joe. I feel like we've been having a conversation for about a decade now. So it's great to see you again and be here again, and yeah, fantastic. So I'll show some projects that I've been working on, and then we'll kind of segue that to a discussion perhaps about some of them. And yeah, so just get right into it. I guess a lot of the one kind of body of projects that I've been doing the last couple of years is really looking at the infrastructures of mass surveillance, and by extension, the kind of infrastructures of global telecommunication system, which are both indistinguishable from one another. And that was kind of prompted by this film called Citizenfour, and this is a film made by Laura Poitras, who of course was the person that Edward Snowden first went to in early 2013. And when this project kind of started, this Snowden project, I had been friends with Laura for a long time, and she knew that I kind of had a history of looking at infrastructures, and in particular looking at classified military infrastructures. So she asked me to kind of join the project to do 2 things. One was to research some of the material that was in this archive and just try to understand what these infrastructures that were being described in the archive were, on one hand, and then on the second hand, to think about how do you try to develop a visual language that speaks to this. And the reason why this was kind of an important project for me, but I think also for all the people that were working on this material, was that the kind of metaphors that we have in popular culture to understand what the internet is, and by extension mass surveillance, are just terrible. Like, so for example, if you do a Google image search for like the internet, I think this is the first image that shows up. So this is like, this is the image that we have. This is the whole light coming, it's ones and zeros and crap. That is number 2 or 3 in Google image search. I mean, this is literally a mystifying metaphor right in front of you. This is getting accurate. But what was so interesting about this Snowden archive, not only did it describe, surveillance and weapon systems that were on the scale of a planet, but it kind of gave you a set of goggles that you could use to see what global telecommunications infrastructures look like through the eyes of an entity like NSA. And when the NSA looks at the internet, this is not the metaphors that they use, right? So the Snowden documents and NSA itself understands the internet as an exquisitely material thing and a very specifically cited thing, right? It understands the internet as being, consisting of cables that connect all of the continents of the Earth together in very specific places. Inside those cables are, light that are being modulated at very specific frequencies that do very specific kinds of work. This is what I think, in terms, we were talking about the planetary or whatever, this is one of the most remarkable slides, I think, in the Snowden archive in terms of just an image of what the world looks like through the eyes of the NSA. This is a slide that is kind of give you a little bit of a global overview, not only of how they understand the internet, but how they attack it and how they have militarized it and weaponized it. And this is a slide that has a key here, and you see all these different dots here. All of these dots mean something. This green dot, which are obscured in the map, those are third-party relationships that NSA has. So there's a thing called Five Eyes. The primary relationships NSA has is a group of countries called Five Eyes, which is the US, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And there's information sharing and infrastructure sharing between all of those countries. Beyond those countries, NSA will have partnerships with like Danish secret intelligence, German intelligence, Saudi intelligence, what have you. And those are called third-party relationships. Now we have other things here. We have this thing called here regional, which are these red dots. And what they mean by that says regional 80 plus SCS. Those are generally hardware that are installed in embassies and consulates around the world. So most US embassies and most consulates are also giant bugs. So for example, the NSA was famously tapping Angela Merkel, German's cell phone. They were doing that from the US Embassy in Berlin. So they do that all over the world too. These orange dots, foreign sat, means foreign satellites. So what NSA has done all over the world is basically set up shadow ground stations for satellites where they can basically suck everything off every satellite that's in orbit around the Earth. CNE here, this yellow dot that you see these peppered all over the place. This is a map from, I think, 2013 or 2012. What that stands for is Computer Network Exploit. And that means two things. It means one of two things. Either it means places where NSA or the military has installed malicious software on other countries' internet backbones, right? So they have software sitting on other people's infrastructures that then they can use to manipulate that network, spy on it, what have you. And the other thing that means is actual hardware implants on other countries' internet backbones. So for example, a lot of the internet is built on Cisco routers. And NSA had a program for a while where Cisco would ship routers to a different country. NSA would literally intercept the FedEx boxes, open them up, install their own hardware in the routers, pack it back up, and send it on. And so they literally have little bugs all over the world's internet backbone. And finally here, these blue dots they call large cable. And what these are has to do with the way in which all the continents are connected to each other in the internet. And the continents are all connected through undersea cables. And something around 98% of the world's data flows under the oceans inside cables. And those cables converge at very specific places that are called landing sites. So this is an example of this. You see all these cables going across the Atlantic. They're converging here in Cornwall in the UK. And so the Cornwall, UK is the connection between the Americas and Europe. And so these are very juicy targets for NSA, because if you have a conjunction of international cables coming together and you put a tap on that conjunction of cables, you're actually able to see a huge amount of the traffic going over the internet, because it's going through very specific places in the world. These are some of the access sites in the United States. They're all named after ski resorts. Breckenridge, Tapa, Sun Valley. So this is Oregon. This is Northern California, a place called Point Arena. Sun Valley is Morro Bay. Maverick is Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Copper Mountain and Billington are New Jersey and Long Island for the most part. Storm Brew has to do with Verizon. Fairview has to do with AT&T. And again, you can see these access points, these green dots here. And these are places where NSA is sitting on the American internet backbone as well. So one project I've been doing is simply like going around to these landing sites, these choke points, and trying to photograph them. And when you photograph them, there's not really anything to photograph, because you have this conjunction of fiber optic cables, but they're underwater and they're under beaches. So they'll typically, as they come towards shore, they'll go underground, go under a beach, and then go into an unmarked building somewhere. And so the kind of logic of these photographs is that within this frame has to be this choke point, but obviously it's not visible in the photograph itself. So when I exhibit these, then I pair those with collages of documents and photographs that all speak to the thing that's going on in the other photograph, but which is invisible in it. And this is a combination of public documents, historical documents, as well as documents from the Snowden archives itself. This is Miami. So I was working on this for a while and continuing to work on this, looking at these seascapes, but I thought, well, if there's these cables that are kind of a conjunction of cables in the water here, what would happen if you learned how to scuba dive? Like, could you dive into these photographs somehow and like see these things on the ocean floor? And so I learned how to scuba dive in a swimming pool in Kreuzberg, Germany, and started looking around and trying to find places where a cable would be coming onshore, but it would have to emerge from the ground somewhere underwater. In other words, if there was a reef in the way or something like that, where a cable would have to come out from under the ground. And started working with divers and kind of develop search patterns to try to find these things. And when you get lucky, you're actually able to find them. So this is a cable here called Maya 1. This is I think this is a cable called Bix 1. These are all undersea cables that the vast majority of the internet goes through. So again, just trying to build out this vocabulary, try to develop a vocabulary with which to try to learn how to see this secret state or these infrastructures or what have you. One of the things that I'm always fascinated with is not only at the level of infrastructure and hardware, but the kind of cultural stuff. Like what happens at the level of language? What happens at the level of metaphors? And one of the things that is endlessly fascinating to me is code names. There's tens of thousands of classified projects that NSA does, and they need a way to talk about them. And the way that they do that is that they invent nonsensical names for each program. And so they really develop a language that if you are read into a program, this language makes sense to you, but if you're not, then this language doesn't make any sense to you. And it's pretty interesting to see how that happens. So, for example, here they're talking about something called shell trumpet, and there's something called dancing oasis. They're talking about here oak star, mystic, musketeer, and the trillion records processed have resulted in over 35 million tips to traffic thief. Again, these kind of nonsensical names. And so I've been doing a project of just collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of these things and doing various things with them. One of the things that we did for the premiere of Citizen 4 in London was project them on buildings for a week around London, including Parliament. So there's a week in October where you could go out and that night, and every night there was some code names scrolling across Parliament. Kind of back to this question of infrastructure, I'm not only interested in the kind of Earth's surface and what the kind of planetary scale on the Earth's surface of surveillance infrastructures, but human infrastructures also extend into space. There's a vertical axis here as well. You can think about communications and by extension surveillance and military infrastructures going from the bottom of the seas to about 36,000 kilometers in orbit around the Earth. So for many years, I've had a project where I've been trying to track and photograph all of the secret satellites that are in the skies. And the way that's done kind of technically is like with a weird hybrid version of astronomy. And the way that you do it is that if you're a researcher, if you have any reason for data about satellites, you can create an account with US Strategic Command, and they'll give you twice a day a bulk download of all of the tracking data of satellites that they're tracking. And this is very useful for people in a lot of different fields. This data is useful, obviously, if you're in the aerospace industry and you are a ground controller for satellites, you want to figure out where they are, and you want to hit somebody or what have you. But it's also very useful to people who do like atmospheric science and stuff that study the Earth's upper atmosphere, because you can learn a lot about what is going on in the upper atmosphere by looking at perturbations in satellite orbits. So there's a number of fields that gain from this data. Now, in this military catalog is basically everything that they track except secret satellites. But to kind of quote, I have the great American epistemologist Donald Rumsfeld, this gives you a list of known knowns, right? So you have your military list of everything that's in the sky. You go out, you look in the sky, you see something, you look it up in the military catalog. If it's not there, you know you've seen something secret. And so there's a group of amateur astronomers around the world, about a dozen guys who do this basically every night, and over many, many years have kind of produced this addendum to the Strategic Command catalog that's just numbers that look like this that describe the orbits of classified satellites that they found. And so when you can kind of take these numbers, you can model those orbits, and the NRO or NSA, they can have all the secret satellites that they want, but they can't have their own secret laws of physics, right? And so satellites have to follow Kepler's laws of planetary motion. So you can literally use early 17th century mathematics to kind of figure out where these things are. I'm terrible at early 17th century mathematics, so you use a computer. But once you've modeled an orbit, you can make a prediction about where they will be, and if you've done everything right, those predictions tend to be accurate. This is very heady stuff for someone with a background like me in social science and art. Like the idea that we're going to predict where something will be in the sky when it's actually there. Blew my mind when I started figuring out how to do this. So anyway, you can kind of find these things and learn how to photograph them. So in an image like this, what you're seeing, that streak moving through the middle of the frame, is it's kind of an evil twin of the Hubble Space Telescope. It's called a keyhole satellite that's kind of pointed down at Earth instead of looking out at the heavens. And the orange area that you're seeing is, this is actually shot from San Francisco, so you're seeing city lights bouncing off the low clouds in San Francisco and the kind of satellite in the background. These guys, again, I'm interested in the culture and metaphors that get created internally around this stuff. So this is a patch that was a kind of successor to that that Joe wanted to try to talk about later. But I guess these guys didn't. There's a whole history of this image of the octopus eating the world. The octopus, traditionally, is always either Hitler or Stalin, right? So, it's never the good guy, right? But we wanted to. I was going to just drill down a little bit into some projects specifically to kind of address to kind of set up a conversation about how some of the ways in which warfare might be changing. In 2009, okay. A little bit of background is that even if the military launches a secret satellite, they always announce a rocket launch, right? because you can't just launch a rocket. If you just launch a rocket, then somebody's going to think that you started World War III. So they'll always say, we're going to launch a rocket on this date. It's a classified payload. This is sort of what it's going to do. They're not saying what the function is, but they say what the rocket is going to do. And they'll usually say, if it's a military satellite, they'll say it's a classified satellite, but it'll have a military index number. And if it's an intelligence satellite, it will usually have what's called an NROL number, which stands for National Reconnaissance Office Launch, right? So they'll say, in general, they say what agency is responsible for it, when the rocket's going to go off, and nothing more. They'll just say it's a classified thing. This thing shows up on the launch manifest in 2009, and nobody had ever seen anything like this before. It's this thing called PAN. And PAN is described as a classified payload, but does not have a military index number and does not have an NROL launch number. So what the hell is this? Nobody's seen this before. The patch came out. It says Palladium at night. I don't know if you can tell here, but there's a little question mark in the smoke below the rocket. So it said Palladium at night, but a word on the street was that PAN just stood for pick a name. Right? So early speculation, so we knew PAN was going into a geostationary orbit. That's the kind of orbit that you go into if you're a communication satellite normally. And it was kind of a mystery. So you start thinking about, okay, who would want to have a classified satellite who's not NRO and who's not the military, right? And NSA is typically under NRO. So is there another government agency, a classified agency, that want to have a satellite who's not the intelligence, who's not NRO / NSA and not the military? You think about it a little bit, and you're like, okay, well maybe CIA, right? And CIA doesn't put their name on anything, so that would sort of be consistent with the CIA thing. But then, so PAN goes up into this orbit, which is called the geostationary orbit. It's an orbit that's used for communication satellites. And it parks itself over the Indian Ocean. And so you're like, okay, here's a photograph of it in this little cluster of satellites here. Here's a close-up. So PAN is this little dot right here. And so you think about it a little bit, and you think about, okay, let's go down this conspiracy theory of it being a CIA satellite. Why would the CIA want to have a dedicated satellite over the Indian Ocean? And the obvious thing you might think of is like, well, they want a satellite to like talk to their guys in Pakistan and Iraq and things like that. And that's a good initial theory, but it's actually not a good theory. It's not a good theory because there's a massive amount of bandwidth that these communication satellites can handle. It's way overkill for just doing any kind of communication stuff like phone calls or anything like that. But then you think about it a little bit more and you think like, well, what else could it do? And then you think about, well, 2009, that's when the drone war really gets taking off. And of course we know there's two versions of the drone war. There's the military version of it, but all the drone war stuff that's in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, all that, that's all CIA. Right, the CIA does like illegal stuff and the military does legal stuff. I mean, obviously that's a pretty silly way of phrasing it, but that's the way that I think about it. So that was a working theory, but then the theory started to get a little bit more complicated because PAN started doing another thing that nobody had ever seen before, which is that PAN started moving around. And every 6 months, PAN, you can see here in this image that PAN is co-locating itself with a cluster of other communication satellites. And what it starts doing is every 6 months it moves and parks itself into another cluster of communication satellites. And so what you're seeing is something that nobody had ever seen before, which is to go down that version of a conspiracy theory. Why would I want to have a communication satellite that would co-locate with other communication satellites? Well, a communication satellite does two things. It receives signals and broadcasts them. So if you co-locate with other communication satellites, you could potentially be a kind of roving bug through the geostationary belt and be able to spy on satellites that you might not have a good ground station for example. That's conspiracy theory number 2. The end. That's what this research is like sometimes. That's what it comes wanted to quickly move some of this stuff. So I mean, that was a very brief introduction to some of the kinds of work that I've done around infrastructure and looking at these kind of systems on multiple scales and looking at the culture of them a little bit too. But I have a whole other kind of project that I'm really interested in as well, which is trying to think about what other kinds of infrastructures might be. And I think about these as kind of impossible objects. I think about them as objects that the society and the political relations that we live within sort of can't produce, right? It's kind of emotional things. So this is a project that I've been doing with a guy named Jacob Appelbaum, who's a very well-known computer security researcher and kind of digital civil liberties activist, journalist, many, many things. And this is a sculpture we designed where it's called Autonomy Cube. And you install it in a museum, and when you install it in a museum, you plug the museum's internet into it, and you plug power into it, so it becomes a part of the museum's communications infrastructure. And then what it does is it does two things. The first thing that it does is that it creates an open Wi-Fi network throughout the museum that anybody can use. Anybody can log onto. It's called Autonomy Cube and go use the internet. But what it does, instead of being a normal internet connection, what it does is it routes all of the traffic that people in the museum are using over the Tor network. And the Tor network is a kind of infrastructure that sits on top of the internet that is designed to anonymize communications. So Tor is, think about like the kind of normal internet here on this layer, and the normal internet is kind of set up in such a way from the get-go so that everybody can see what everybody is doing. Like that's the point of the internet. It's kind of, those are kind of radical openness among the communications protocols and things like that. And that has kind of created the opportunity for the internet to become the greatest tool of mass surveillance in the history of mankind. The reason for that is because it's a global communication system that's totally open. Anybody on the internet can kind of see what anybody else is doing if they want to do it that way. So Tor was initially created by the Navy because they had a problem. They wanted to do open source intelligence collection. In other words, the Navy and other parts of the intelligence community have people whose job it is to just read the newspaper, like in Iran, North Korea, what have you, every day. And if you do that on the open internet, everybody in the Iranian government, at the Iranian newspaper, and everybody in between can see these guys in this building in Maryland or what have you are reading this newspaper every day. They didn't like that. And so they wanted to have a system that would anonymize their traffic and would anonymize their location. And this is what Tor does. So it's a series of volunteer-run routers that sits on top of the internet that you can connect to, and it will first encrypt your signal, and then it will bounce those signals around to a series of randomly chosen other Tor relays, and then we'll let you out on the open internet. So for example, if you connected to Tor from University of Chicago, you connect to Tor, and you might say, I want to go look at Yahoo or whatever. It's a server, and let's pretend it's in Palo Alto. You'd say, I want to go to Yahoo, and Tor will say, okay, well, we're going to eventually get you over to Yahoo, but first we're going to bounce you through a relay in Japan, for example, then one in Australia, and then you'll come out from a relay in Romania onto the open internet. So now to the open internet, you're going to look like an anonymous user in Romania, right? So that's kind of how Tor works. And Tor is used for all kinds of different things. You can use it to circumvent internet infrastructures in places like China or Turkey where the internet is censored. You can use it to anonymize your location, obviously. It's also, I think it's really important in terms of anonymizing your data trail. In other words, if you have health problems or something like that, or if you have, things that you're interested in that you don't want Google to know about, that you don't want the NSA to know about, and that sort of thing, you would use Tor to do that, to try to have no trace on that open internet, or just have an anonymous trace. Now the second thing that the Autonomy Cube does is that, this is, you kind of connect to it, this is me wearing a Slayer t-shirt after installing all these things, is that it turns the museum into one of these Tor relays itself. So when you install it in a museum, you talk to the IT guys who say, you're going to give our sculpture like 100 megabits or something like that. And then the museum's internet infrastructure itself becomes one of these Tor nodes. So in other words, it allows people all over the world to anonymize their traffic using the museum's internet connection. And then there's always a kind of dialectic here that by cyber command resistance is futile. Another project kind of in this tradition of trying to make impossible objects is for a number of years we've been trying to build a satellite that has no military value, has no scientific value, and has no military value at all. In other words, we've been trying to build a satellite that's the exact opposite of every other satellite that's ever been built. And this is the kind of the final design of it. Now it's a little satellite like this, and it uses a huge sat specification. And it's designed to piggyback on a rocket, on somebody else's rocket kind of going up. And when it goes out, it kind of gets shot out the side, so now we have our little satellite, which is about this big, floating in space. And then what happens is the satellite opens up, and inside the satellite is a giant balloon that inflates itself and is very reflective. So the satellite then, once it's in space, it reflects sunlight down to Earth, and you can kind of see how that works here. And when it does this, it effectively kind of creates an artificial star in the sky. And that lasts about 3 weeks, and then it burns up, and that's the whole project. So these are some of the models that we've been showing.
Trevor, you're going to put a patch on the...
I've designed lots of patches for that project here. During conference calls, I have a huge collection of conference call design patches. And then to sort of sum up, we've been looking at some of this stuff on a very kind of spatial axis in a way. If we think about internet infrastructures or military programs, satellites, that sort of thing. There's also a temporal axis that much of this stuff exists on, and there's a few projects that I kind of just wanted to share with you very briefly that try to engage that. One of the things that I realized while studying communication satellites, and communication satellites are really far away from Earth. They're about 24,000 miles or 36,000 kilometers away. And they're actually so far away from Earth that when they power down and die, they don't ever come back down. Most satellites are in what are called low Earth orbit, and low Earth orbit satellites, when they die, they eventually kind of like spiral back into the Earth and kind of burn up in the atmosphere. Geostationary satellites are so far away that that doesn't happen. And in fact, when you do the math saying like how long was the decay time of a satellite at 36,000 kilometers, it's infinity. And I kind of came across this fact and called up a friend of mine who's an astronomer, and I said, this is really weird. Like, I'm trying to figure out decay times for geostationary satellites, and I'm just getting infinity. And he said, yeah, that's right. And I said, what are you talking about, that's right? He said, yeah, they don't decay. And I said, okay, well, what that means is in space, there's no erosion, there's no volcanism, there's no rain, there's nothing like that. So if it is true that the decay time of a geostationary satellite is infinity, then geostationary satellites are the longest lasting objects that humans have made, with the exception of like Voyager and New Horizons and that sort of thing. And my friend the astronomer said, yeah, I think about them as artifacts. So the implication of this is pretty kind of crazy, if we want to get into this whole planetary Anthropocene kind of stuff, which is that since the advent of geostationary satellites in the early 1960s, the humans have basically built a ring around the Earth. A ring around the Earth that's not so different than the rings of Jupiter or Saturn, but instead the rings of Earth are made out of like dead machines that the humans have put in orbit. And that ring of dead machines around the Earth is now a permanent part of the planet. It's like literally living in cosmic time. And so the project that we did was just try to think through this. Like, this is actually, and this is also sort of in this category of impossible objects, because this is an impossible question of how do you think through the fact that humans can make something that lasts on a galactic timescale or a cosmic timescale, when that is something that we literally cannot imagine what that is. So we started thinking about, well, could we at least acknowledge this somehow? And we started thinking about cave paintings, images that we have in the present that are kind of stranded in time, and what happens to an image when it becomes stranded in time. And so I was an artist in residence at MIT for a while in the aeronautics and astronautics department. And I went there and I said, So we need to design some art that first can live in space, and two, is as archival as the sun. And the guys there were like, okay, well, sure, I guess we can kind of figure that out. The takeaway quote was, we were able to engineer this thing with a kind of crystalline atomic structure that was very, very stable. And my takeaway quote was from Carl Berggren, one of the scientists who worked on it. He said, well, nobody knows what happens in 6 billion years, but this should at least last for a couple of 100 million. It's like so we made this thing, and we are actually able to convince a company called EchoStar that they should install this on the rear end of a spacecraft called EchoStar 16. And we launched it from Kazakhstan on a Proton rocket. And this is a photograph of it in the sky right here, that little dot. And it's basically just a collection of images that have to do, it starts out with a very obscure image. The first image in the collection is a photograph of the backside of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus image, it's sort of a very famous image. And then the other kinds of images have to do with the ways in which humans have transformed the surface of the Earth. And this is actually an image that just existed. This is the bees at Los Alamos that have been trained to become weapons detectors. I think your quote for that is, this is an image of the future of life, life that has been turned into a weapon in the name of preserving life. So that, transformations to the surface of the Earth, the biosphere, there's a bunch of jokes in here. Flies, a drone over Waziristan, a field of flowers across from a political prisoner camp. And finally, on the kind of temporal axis, and this really dovetails with a lot of Joe's work. About a year or two ago, I was commissioned to do a project for the Fukushima exclusion zone in Japan. So that in Japan, around there's an area that is so radioactive that's basically closed off. You kind of can't go in there in the aftermath of the tsunami. And I was commissioned to make a public artwork for this exclusion zone. And it was to make an artwork that would be installed in the exclusion zone, and the artwork would open to the public when the exclusion zone itself would open. Maybe that would be in 30 years, maybe that would be in 300,000 years. Nobody knows. So the project that we did was to go to New Mexico and collect a lot of what's called trinitite. And trinitite was formed when the first nuclear weapon was exploded in the desert in New Mexico. And when you set off a nuclear weapon, it creates an explosion that's many times hotter than the surface of the sun. And so in New Mexico, it basically turned the surface of the desert into a green glass that's called trinitite. So we went and collected some of that green glass from New Mexico. And then we sent people into the exclusion zone in radiation suits to collect broken glass from windows and things like that had been destroyed in the tsunami and that had been irradiated. And then we kind of fused those two forms of glass and melted it all down into this cube that was then now reinstalled back in that exclusion zone where it actually continues to collect radiation. So it's now this radioactive sculpture in the middle of the exclusion zone in Japan that will open in 30 years or 30,000 years or 300,000 years, who knows. So with that, we'll kind of take it from there.
Well, first of all, it's a remarkable range of projects. It's all over the planet. It's dealing with deep time. It's dealing with outer space. It's dealing with communications. It's dealing with national security. It's dealing with commerce. So, one thing I always take from Trevor's work is that first, the materiality of human activity always leaves traces. And so this is a marvelous insight that all those things that announce themselves as secret, hidden as covert. Trevor's taught me over the years that there are many ways to study those things and to find them, doing an extraordinary amount of legwork as we've just seen. I thought maybe what we could could talk a little bit about is what's happening to the face of warfare right now. And maybe also to talk a little bit about what it means to be living inside the technological systems that have been built up over time. And if we think in relation to both the satellite work, the Fukushima disaster, the internet cables, these are all complex systems that were designed to do some kind of utilitarian purpose, but in fact now we find ourselves living inside them in some way that is uncontrollable, and that also has claims on a strange new version of the future. We've been talking about what the longevity of infrastructures are now, and how they reproduce themselves over time, as well as the accidents that accrue from living within such complicated systems. So maybe it's just an opening kind of question. We could think together a little bit about how consequential you think like the last 10 to 15 years of national security sciences are, and how your thinking has maybe moved on that issue.
I mean, I think this is like, I think there's a lot more of the same and also some new stuff, and we can talk about both.
Yeah.
I do think that in certain spheres, this kind of planetary footprint, now it's not just bases, right? That's the old World War model. You have bases in South Korea, and you can have your strategic kind of landscape. With the advent of things like the internet and global telecommunication systems on one hand, and a kind of sphere around the Earth of space-based, weapon system, imaging systems, communication systems, this has opened up all kinds of new possibilities for warfare. That, you couple that with the end of the Cold War, where there's not like one clear, like Russia or something like that you're trying to go against. One of the things that I've seen post-Cold War weapon systems being developed takes advantage of both of those things. And I think that the new thing that you see, and again, it's new by degrees, but I think like the newer kind of school weapon systems are weapon systems that allow you to attack anywhere in the world, to attack critical infrastructure anywhere that you want in the world, in such a way that the person you're attacking doesn't necessarily know whether they've been attacked. And if they do figure out that they've been attacked, it's very, very difficult to attribute where that attack came from. A great example of this is Stuxnet, right? The weaponized malware that was developed to spin up the Iranian nuclear centrifuges and to kind of destroy the Iranian nuclear weapons manufacturing infrastructure kind of over and over again. And the Iranians kind of couldn't tell what the hell was going on. They didn't know if it was an equipment malfunction, whether they'd been attacked, blah, 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 blah. And still that question of attribution of Stuxnet, I mean, at this point, like the Israelis and the US have sort of admitted that they did it, but still, that question of attribution is very difficult. We're seeing similar kinds of things happen in space, and that PAM is a little bit of an example of like that, where you have a satellite that's actually moving around the geostationary belt and actually able to intercept other satellites. There was a couple other programs like that. There was an early one in the early 90s called Prowler, and then there's a more recent one called MITEX. And what they were doing was building very small satellites that would be able to move around the geostationary belt. So the geostationary belt is this ring around Earth that's mostly communication satellites and weather satellites and that sort of thing. Now, if you build the geostationary belt is very hard to monitor. It's a little bit too far out to monitor with radar, although the US has very powerful radars that can monitor it. Other countries really don't. It's also very, very difficult to monitor optically because it's so far away. Like through a normal telescope, you can see a big telecommunication satellite, but smaller satellites are very, very difficult to track. So the US was building a kind of fleet of little satellites that would be able to go up to other satellites and turn them off, or turn them back on, or sabotage them. Now, communication satellites can fail all the time for unknown reasons. So this is another example of a kind of weapon system where you can go, turn off somebody else's communication satellite. Engineers on the ground don't know what what happened, maybe the satellite just failed, maybe who knows what happened. And it's very difficult to detect that that attack has occurred, and it's reversible, and they can turn the satellite right back on if they want. And I think that kind of speaks a little bit to some of the things that you were talking about in terms of this everywhere, nowhere kind of
That's right, yeah.
Landscape of.
So let me just go into a little bit. It seems to me that the story you're telling is largely an American story of
Yeah.
technology,
Yeah.
right? So, so this is one thing that I think it's very hard, particularly in the U.S., for people to hear, right? Is precisely the level of investment, the level of creativity, the level of imagination for something like a planetary control mechanism in certain technological arenas. For those things to be pursued so consistently across a number of domains, at the same time, within a place like the U.S., we have a problem in Flint, Michigan with water, or we have a problem with funding public defenders in a place like New Orleans, or we have a problem with basic educational infrastructures. So this maybe part of this new kind of war is also selectively choosing which infrastructures matter.
Absolutely.
And so what I've learned from your work over the years is that it's really important to attend precisely these investments to understand where the political decisions are actually being made. We were talking a little bit earlier that the U.S. Nuclear complex right now is pursuing a renewal strategy for itself. And this doesn't come with a big ideological project around some enemy that needs to be deferred or defended or defeated, but it's more maintaining the capacity of the nuclear weapons world itself. And so the current programmatic plan is a 30-year effort to rebuild weapons, delivery mechanisms, bombers, missiles, to the tune of about $1 trillion. That's the estimate that can be seen from the current point of time. And so the idea that one infrastructure is now being chosen over another is something that maybe is the grounds of the political. And you talk about civic reclaiming secret infrastructures as civic infrastructures.
But I want to because I know this is something that you've thought about a lot. Why do you think that these kinds of infrastructures reproduce themselves in ways that schools have a much harder time doing, for example? I know this is something you've thought about a lot.
Yeah. Well, one is the power of fear and threat to organize social life. And I would say that something like existential danger from 45 on has been one of the great political resources in the U.S. for the systems that you're talking about. Secrecy is another huge part of it, right? You can do all sorts of things in secret that you can't do in a democratic system. In the open, where you have to make an argument and you have to make the choices about alternate forms. That combination has been a hugely productive one in the U.S. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about how you imagine the kind of deeper futurity of these systems that you're studying, right?
I do think that that there is an important point. Like there's one point about one of the things that I talk about a lot with these kind of infrastructures is like kind of I think that when we have a tendency, when we think about the military, particularly when we think about the secret parts of the military, I think we have a tendency to say like, oh, that's this other alien spaceship that kind of landed somewhere in the state that has nothing to do with us. And I really try to reclaim that and think like, no, these are civic infrastructures in exactly the same way that schools or libraries are. And that's just something that I try to articulate to myself as a way to be able to imagine taking some kind of responsibility for them, or to be able to imagine having some kind of say in them. Right now, I don't think that doesn't work just if I kind of think that way, but I do think that within the culture at large, in the U.S. there's kind of this military culture, and then there's the rest of the culture, and they're really different from each other, and that doesn't. And I think a lot of that actually has to do with the fact that there is a volunteer military in the United States, right? In the sense that there's not mandatory military service, so you can grow up your whole life having nothing to do with the military at all, even though the military's global footprint is quite huge.
But we also have these funny kind of disconnects. So, after the Snowden revelation, which, was maybe the most unprecedented global leak of information ever, and maybe one of the most significant in terms of not just revealing, a specific program or interest, but a vast range of enterprises to capture modern telecommunications and to make it useful. There's really never been anything like it in terms of the kind of civil activisms from within the secret world, I think. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about what kinds of reactions that has produced. You travel in many, many different worlds, art worlds, you spend a lot of time in Europe, in the US, and it seems to me that those Snowden revelations have been experienced rather differently in different places. And certainly the US reaction has been an odd one.
But also there's been many, many different kinds of reactions in many different sectors. I also talk to a lot of people in the telecommunications industry, and I want to meet high-level telecommunications people. I always say so now you know about what NSA does on the backbone. Is that surprising? And they say, well, and very consistently what I've heard is everybody knew that technically you could do that if you wanted to do that, but nobody believed that anybody in the world had the gumption or kind of hubris to actually do that. To the level, whether it is compromising the encryption standards, or whether it's literally intercepting Cisco routers and putting bugs in them and sending them off to the installed places. I think everybody in that industry was really shocked. And so one thing for sure there's still, even within telecommunications industry, there's layers, right? There's the backbone layer, which is AT&T and L3. AT&T has been a front cover for the NSA since the beginning, right? So that's, literally, they make a huge amount of money from charging NSA for access to the cable, something like that. But now you have the kind of internet protocol layer on top of that with, the Googles and Apples and that sort of thing. And I think within that culture, there was a lot of anger about the extent to which NSA had installed their hardware on the backbone. And I think one of the slides that is really indicative of that was a very famous slide of two Google data centers, and it says SSL added and removed here in a smiley face. It's an NSA slide talking about basically showing that NSA had inserted themselves into the dedicated lines, that are internal to a Google, between Google data centers, between Facebook data centers. And I think when people at Google saw that, they're like, okay, you lost us, no, fuck you. So I think that's one reaction. At the popular level, in Germany, where we're spending a lot of time, it's a very different public conversation. I think that has to do with historical reasons, as well as there just is a different sense of, there isn't the same kind of alienation from the state as there is in the US. It's really weird, and so I think there is much more of a sense that infrastructures are civic institutions, that they have politics built into them, and people should have something to say about that. It's just much more present there.
So the NRO slide that you showed of the octopus wrapped around the Earth with nowhere out of our reach, that's also could be read as a kind of reaction to the Snowden revelations, right? It comes out in the midst of all of them. They could have pulled this for all sorts of reasons, but instead it was embracing the caricature, right? So I always think of that as one, it means everybody's sharing the same popular culture, so the references travel. But then also, it's a little like what happened in downtown Chicago during the Occupy movement, where in front of the Trade Center, people were saying, we're the 99%, and all the traders put along the wall, and we're the 1%. And that was just the line. And I thought that's what, NRO guys are going to say. Right? It's like, we have it.
Yeah.
Right? So there's also these kinds of affects and these imaginaries that empower the next generations of these systems. And so one thing that I've been really thinking a lot about is how the notion of infrastructure, which is about capacity, about technology, also relies on, in the security world in particular, certain affects also certain deep structural imaginaries that can project into a future either dangers or resources that are required. So one way we can talk about that is that this new state is actually not fighting a particular war, but it's interested in building and endlessly building capacities to fight any kind of war. And so that scaling that we're talking about, from being able to turn equipment on and off globally, to maintaining nuclear weapons, on the other hand, the old school notion of a kind of strategic defense, all that can be happening simultaneously.
Absolutely. But I think like to kind of expand on like thinking about how these systems play itself out in the future, like that, one of the things that we got to keep in mind is that increasingly, especially when we're talking about telecommunications infrastructures, it's not really true that there's like warfare and NSA data over here, and then there's like Facebook over here, and then there's like Google over here. These things are all kind of the same thing, even though they're different companies and they don't necessarily get along with each other. There's a kind of a paradigm that underlines all of them, right? In the following sense. Like NSA collecting all data of everybody's emails and putting it in the data center at Utah is in some ways you could say that's akin to the rejuvenation of the nuclear weapons program. It's like, why are you storing all this data? Because we can, because we might need it someday. And at the same time, the Googles and the Facebooks are doing that for the exact same reason, although they've been able to monetize it in terms of advertising and things like that today. But the next layer of that, so today, Facebook and Google is collecting every internet search that you do, every website that you visit, everything that you do online, all the contents of all your Gmail, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Today, they want to sell you Crocs or whatever it is, right? But that's not actually what they want to do. What they actually want to do is have it tied to your Fitbit and have it tied to your location information in your phone and sell that to insurance companies, right? So you worked out only 4 hours, you only worked out 4 hours this week. Your insurance premium is going to go up for this month. In the insurance, real estate, credit, finance, I mean, the kind of direction that it's moving in is towards this incredibly individualized, the ability to kind of modulate your economic kind of space within the marketplace at a very, very precise level. And that's akin to, that's on the kind of capital side, but then on the military side, you probably want to be able to do something analogous to that as well. And I think when you put that in the greater context of a future that is, going to be characterized by huge upheavals, like as a result of kind of climate change and like what that means for kind of food and migration and that sort of thing on one hand, and then on the other hand, like just like increasing like economic inequality and the kind of complete pillaging of what's left of any kind of civic institutions. I mean, you're setting up a very scary situation, which is kind of already here.
And one that, if you're thinking about it in these terms, you might want all sorts of scalable responses if you're a military state. It seems to me that one thing that we could think about is the kind of difference between the global scale and the planetary on these issues. And I think now that there's actually a friction between these two, and the kind of built infrastructures that we have are something that's achieved global status, right? They're built infrastructures, but they don't capture everything that's happening on the planet, right? But what climate change is and why it is so difficult for the existing institutions to actually respond to in a very direct kind of way is that it's operating on this other scale, which is, the entire atmospheric, here you can see, mention it, speaks up on for itself, yeah. And so I think now that, there's also a kind of added dimension to this, which is that the military systems that are striving to be something like planetary don't actually get there in the same way that the problems are planetary, and that there's also a kind of effort to secure the nation-state form at precisely the moment where it's in the way of a lot of these problems, particularly in the U.S. context.
So how do you see that playing out when we talk about the scale of kind of politics articulated in a certain way is the scale of rights is at the scale of the state, And yet, the scale of climate change is a temporal scale going hundreds of thousands of years, as well as a much messier kind of topology that doesn't acknowledge borders and doesn't acknowledge,
Absolutely, and also where, practices in the global north are changing living conditions in the global south in these ways that, we have to have all the machineries that you've talked about, all the optics, all the satellites, all the, planetary sciences to actually even be able to see. So, I think this is one of the great dilemmas of the infrastructural question right now, is that some of the problems are only visible because of precisely the satellite remote sensing technologies that you've been talking about, but used and addressed to different problems than what a military state is interested in. And so that's just a conundrum, both to think through the infrastructures that we have, but also to use them to do different kinds of things. Which is why I like your whole project about kind of repurposing and thinking about the impossible objects as ways of imagining a different kind of political possibility in the moment as well. So I have a couple of
I get scared though. I don't.
Yeah.
When I say I get scared, what I mean is that I don't see much in the way of kind of emergent structures that can deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see like any human structures that can account for the planetary or can try to address that, or can even account for temporality, quite frankly.
Yeah. But we do have an example, with the kind of satellites that are in permanent orbit, of the ability to build infrastructures that work on these phenomenal scales, right? So, it is a funny kind of recursive moment where the only example for building large-scale systems are precisely the things that you and I spend a lot of our time critiquing. They need to be purposed to really different kinds of human problems and projects, though. And so, how you get a series of states or a series of organizations to do that kind of work is a kind of classic theme. In your presentation, you brought up the notion of the conspiratorial. And I'm really fascinated by this right now because I think one of the lessons for attentive people over the last, say, generation, looking at the way corporations work, security states function, and so on, is that we need to reclaim the conspiratorial.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
As an analytic structure that is necessary for engaging complex systems that are occluded, that are actively trying to hide themselves in the world, but that we are related to and influenced by all the time. And so I don't know exactly how we purge the conspiratorial of the negative connotations that have come out of Hofstadter's classic paranoid piece, where it becomes a kind of pathological view.
I'm going to push against you a little bit on that, because I think there's two parts of this. Like, when I talk about conspiratorial, I mean that, in a lot of the work that I do, I try to be pretty careful about, this is what I can say.
Yeah.
And then this is what I can imagine based on stuff that I can say. But once we get into me imagining stuff, don't take it very seriously.
Yeah.
And so one thing I don't like about the conspiratorial is that it's easily a way to not do the work, to not do the analysis. So for example, the chemtrails is a great example of that. I used to give these kind of talks in the dog, and people are like, what about chemtrails? And they're like planes doing psychological things. And I'm like, okay, if chemtrails are real, then that means there's going to be maintenance guys at commercial airports who have to be trained in dealing with highly toxic chemicals. When there's an accident, then there has to be fire departments that have hazmat teams that are equipped for that, which means there's going to be reports that are publicly, this kind of whole chain of things, right? So I think that's the thing that I dislike about conspiracy theory, is that it's an easy way to explain things without actually thinking through them. But what I think you're talking about is something, a related part of it, which is more like a kind of a speculative epistemology.
Absolutely. Yeah, and of course, I didn't mean to attribute any kind of conspiracy theory to your work, because all your stuff is falsifiable.
Yeah.
You come to moments where you say, I can't say anything more, or it's I see no evidence that it's happening, right? And in the kind of classic iteration of that term, there is pretty much nothing that can disprove the narrative, right? But what I'm suggesting is exactly this kind of speculative world. We live in these complex, interlocking systems now that affect our lives in all sorts of complicated ways. How do we think about that as political subjects right now? Realizing that we'll never have enough information,
Yeah.
that the systems are too complicated and also too hidden in many respects.
Yeah.
So I take your work as a major contribution to helping us think that problem.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it is really interesting. It's also interesting to see, like, in the physical sciences, like a lot of people are, in my years, like working or something like that, I've seen, on the physical sciences side, like a lot of the people doing that work have been much better about like developing like truly interdisciplinary methods for studying problems. Like, okay, what's the relationship between, bacteria in granite and, ocean acidification and that kind of thing. And they're able to start asking these kinds of questions in ways that I think the social scientists haven't necessarily been able to catch up and certainly not the young people.
That's absolutely more to say. Could you talk just a little bit in a general sense about your own method for doing some of these projects, which require bringing together all sorts of different kinds of experts and fields of knowledge, and then the relationship between that kind of process and the aesthetic form that you put in a gallery space, which is also really transformative to what gallery spaces can be right now.
Yeah, I mean, the process is kind of anarchic, whatever. Okay, so I'll tell you a story. When I was at Berkeley, I was studying geography, and I was about to go into my year where I had to do my qualifying exam. And I had a great advisor there, a guy named Alan Fred, who was he had won kind of like geography's version of the Nobel Prize, doing stuff about systems theory and urbanism and things like that. And he kind of renounced all that work and got really into Walter Benjamin and was like, screw it, I'm just writing like these fragmented texts that you're supposed to create this montage and flashes of da-da-da-da-da-da. So we got on fantastic. So anyway, I was going into my year doing qualifying exams, and I realized like, I haven't taken a single methodology class like in all the time I've written. I went to his office, I was like, oh man, I just realized I haven't taken any methodology classes. And he was like, okay, good, I'm glad you didn't catch on to that. I was trying to have you not take methodology classes.
He was actually steering you away from it.
And I was like, he's like, yeah, that's a bunch of crap. He's like, you know what, the only way to really do work is, he's like, just look at your subject and look at it again and look at it more and look at it more and look at it more. And at some point it will start to tell you how it wants to be studied. And he said that's, really, what he thought was what produced good social science. And so I guess that's the way I work. It's really inefficient, just looking at tons of stuff and asking a lot of questions.
Yeah, because you also have behind each of these projects all these fields of knowledge that you've learned and you've studied with people and you've figured out how to recruit their interests, and you can talk the MIT guys into designing something for you that they
Well,
haven't
it's not
done.
time. I think what it is, I think over and over again, with these kind of projects that are just weird and speculative, or like, hey, let's build a satellite that's totally useless. That's actually what everybody in the aerospace industry wants to do. Like nobody in the aerospace industry signed up because they wanted to build spy satellites. They all signed up because they wanted to like space. Hey, whoa, build crazy like weird stuff on the moon. And I feel like as an artist, you can kind of tap into that over and over.
Well, maybe that's the answer to the question of the new political, is to tap into the enthusiasms that are the non-militarized enthusiasms.
Yeah.
And build communities and collaborations around those kinds of projects. So I'm a little more hopeful.
Well, the reason why I call these impossible objects is because, like, under kind of the version of militarized capitalism that the U.S. economy functions under, like, you can't build this stuff. You know what I mean? There's no, it's not a thing. And so, I actually was having a conversation with Keto Styro, who's a great artist, and we were talking about artificial intelligence or something. She said, the singularity already happened. It's called capitalism. I think neoliberalism would be a little bit more accurate, but I mean, the point being that we have, you know, production in the world is kind of organized according to rules that will be our undoing, you know, and so I think it's really, I think that we can imagine these different kinds of forms of production and things like that, and I think as an artist, to a certain extent, you can make objects that are like, if we lived in a different world, this would maybe be the kinds of stuff we could make. But I'm not sure how scalable that is at the moment.
Yeah, but it's the non-utopian positive future that is structured in the middle of some of those projects, and that is a massive thing to reclaim in a moment where many of the projects are pretty impressive. I suspect our timing is such that we should segue to the next slide of
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Please join me in thanking both Joe and Trevor. And I think we have time for a few questions from the audience, 2 or 3.
Yeah, well, I have two. The PAN, the satellite that sort of intercepts or interdicts other satellites. This progression, the weaponization of space. I'm interested to hear like where you think that's going, and then because of San Bernardino, Apple, in the case of the FBI. So I'm sort of interested also in hearing your thoughts about the relationship between telecommunications and the military, and where do you think that's going as well? Yeah, that relationship.
So the weaponization of space, I think, is pretty similar to the weaponization of the internet, because a lot of the space-based communication systems they were the internet before the internet and are still kind of part of the internet. And when I say the internet, I'm not just talking about like visiting websites, I'm talking about phone calls and just telecommunications, which is what it all is. So I think in space, what you're seeing is ways of deploying new kinds of sensors, ways of developing weapons that are analogous to cyber weapons, like Stuxnet, that sort of thing, where you can go and disable other people's hardware kind of surreptitiously in such ways that they don't know what's going on. And then the other part of that, I think, is then, and this is also happening on the internet as well, is being able to insert your own signal into somebody else's signal. In other words, if you're talking to somebody over there, I'm in the military, I can get in the middle of that and change what you're saying, whether that's literally like in terms of like your email or kind of, you know, changing a communication protocol that you're using or something like that, and with a trigger something or have some kind of effect. Right, so it's a man-in-the-middle attack, but on a much on a much larger scale to do a lot of different kinds of things. You know, and I think you see that happening, you know, on the kind of terrestrial infrastructure as well as the space-based infrastructure. And then what was the second part of the question? I forgot.
Oh, well, the relationship between the telecommunications industries and the military. It seems to be a very close relationship. In San Bernardino, Apple said no. Just where do you think that?
Well, I kind of think that's I brought that up a little bit, which is like, you know, when you look at a lot of the backbone, like companies like AT&T, like AT&T is like really one of the huge ones kind of globally. They've been in bed with NSA since day one, you know, and so like to the point where, you know, they're really a part of NSA more than they're sort of like, you can think of AT&T as a front company for the NSA, which sometimes I do. And I don't think that's entirely inaccurate, you know. But those are old companies that are doing infrastructure stuff and have very deeper relationships. I think the Apples and the to a certain extent the Googles and the Facebooks don't have those same historical connections to the military. And I think some of those relationships were beginning to develop in the case like PRISM was an example of that, which was another kind of FBI NSA program. But I think that some of the culture of those industries is perhaps a little bit more suspicious of the military, and I think like those contradictions have really come to a head in the kind of post-Snowden era, and the Apple case is a perfect example of that. You know, that kind of contradiction. Apple is making a good argument, which is, again, kind of comes to this question of scale. They are saying, look, we can't just break this iPhone for the FBI. If we do that, then we're going to have to do that for China, we're going to have to do that for Russia, we're going to have to do that for everybody in the world. And actually, when in the UK they were talking about passing this Snoopers charter that would have done something similar. And actually, a friend of mine who's a kind of a telecommunications guy said that Apple should make a very simple argument. It should say, okay, if you wanted to do that, then no more iPhones in the UK. We'll start with Parliament and hand over your iPhones. And so I mean, there are these contradictions there.
But there's another component too, which is companies like Google and Facebook offer free services to the public in exchange for capturing their information.
Yeah.
So they are reliant on the goodwill of the public to use their equipment. So as soon as the narrative changes and it's no longer we're giving you a free set of services, but we're actually making you a node for collection, that blows the whole business model, or it has the potential to.
Yeah. Hi. I have two questions. So my first question is about also the technology that the government uses. They're also available to quote unquote everyday people. So for example, people would do like hacktivism. So I'm wondering if the mass like power, if they all engage in this kind of actions, would you think that this is a sufficient like counterforce to this like hegemonizing machine that is called the NSA?
No. Here's what I mean by that. Like, so there are projects like Tor Project and like a lot of nonprofits that are trying to develop security tools that allow you to have some anonymity online, allow you to circumvent state censorship in certain kind of places, and they work, and they're very good tools, and they are and they're great. They create communities, and they do kind of create this new impossible politics that we've kind of been alluding to a little bit. But the reason why I ultimately say no is that if you are the NSA and you're willing to spend $15 billion a year, you can actually just own the whole network. And when you own the whole network, you can do a whole lot of stuff that there's no counter against, right? So tools like Tor can raise the cost of being able to do whatever you want with the internet. But if you can attack the whole internet itself, you can really do a lot of stuff that there's not going to be technological solutions to. So I think there's, the way forward is not just kind of developing like ubiquitous cryptography. I mean, there has to be a policy side to it as well, and there has to be a kind of a civic side to it as well. I don't think that there's the technological fixes to this kind of thing.
An oversight side as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And my second question is about like how individuals should like reconcile with all this like revelations about how the information has been collected. So I've been using the internet since I don't know when I'm 11.
Yeah.
So basically for the past a decade and a half, like my information has been like gathered.
Yeah.
So when I found out all of this, like should I stop using the internet? Should I invest in an air gap machine? Or should I just like use Tor and like search using DuckDuckGo as opposed to Google? So I think that some people might think, well, I'm already screwed, might as well like continue like doing the things the way I did. So it seems that because of how technology is so ubiquitous, most people would think that we're screwed already, so might as well.
Yeah, I think you have to go forward in many different directions at the same time. So I guess like in my life, like I use Tor a lot, but I don't use it for everything. So I'll use Tor for like anything that I use it like if like a friend of mine is having health problems and I want to understand what that's about. I'll definitely use Tor for that because I don't want Google to know that there's some kind of health problem in my family or something like that, and then it's going to sell that to an insurance company. I think about I have a Facebook account, but I'm very I don't put personal stuff on there. I just do like what I'm doing professionally or something like that. I would never put if you're have a picture of like you drinking a beer or something like that. Like that's the kind of thing that I would not put on the internet, because what happens on the background is that there's image recognition algorithms that are looking at all those photographs, identifying everything that's in those, and building that into a profile about you. And so I think it's just, in the short term, in the kind of everyday sense, it's like thinking about what that profile is that you're building, and when there's things that you don't want to be a part of that profile, it's like using tools that help you circumvent that, right? But I'm not saying I don't use the internet at all, if that's what we do. But I think though, in the medium term, there's like questions about thinking about what kinds of data should be able to be used by what kinds of people towards what ends, and thinking about what the implications of that are going to be on an entire society, and kind of thinking at the scale of the society. So for example, like one of the things that's going on already right now is that you have these little Fitbits that counts your heart rate and how much you exercise and things like that. There's companies that will sign you up for health insurance, and you wear a Fitbit, and if you work out and you do your 10,000 steps a day, whatever the heck it is, they'll give you a reduction on your health insurance cost, right? And you might think, hey, that's a great idea. I get some money off my health insurance. I'm like a really healthy person. I exercise a lot, what have you. But when you kind of think about like, if you scale that to the level of a society, does that add up to the kind of society that we want to live in? And I would argue absolutely not, you know, because that's going to kind of exacerbate class divisions in the society. It's going to exacerbate the kind of sense that we're all individual atoms rather than people that are working towards a collective future, right? So I think those are the kind of medium-term questions. And then I think the longer-term question is ultimately this kind of planetary question, and this question about capital, you know, in general, and you know what the future of that looks like.
Okay, we have time for one final question. I'm going to go right to the back row.
Can you talk about what's important to you about materializing your impossible objects, actually manifesting them as objects?
Yeah, like, so you mean like with the autonomy cube and the satellites and that sort of thing? I mean, I guess, for me, it's really important to make them real, to kind of show that it could be real. You know what I mean? I always, like even like with the Last Pictures project, like we did a huge amount of work to make this thing that is actually in space. And like over and over again, I just feel like, well, sure, like once it's in space, nobody can see it. Like the only documentation of it is like a little dot on some photograph and like a book. Like all of the stuff that anybody can see about the project is stuff like is basically, you know, you didn't have to do the project to make all the documentation. But for me, it's really important to actually make these things real first of all, because you kind of develop all these relationships that you have to develop in order to make it real. But the second of all, I think that there is something very powerful about actually making these things in the world that demonstrates the fact that they can be made.
And it seems also that there's spectacular collaboration.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
like there's a whole social thing that is revealed once you try to make it real and move it out of the imagination.
Exactly.
Like one of the things I've always loved about these projects is precisely the unexpected set of people that have to come together. So for your Other Night Sky project, you know, to learn that there's a network of people actually caring deeply about what's tracking in the heavens every night and building a record of their own about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely.
I'm sorry that we're out of time for more questions, but I want to invite everyone to continue the conversation over the wine and cheese in the lobby, and to join me once again in thanking Trevor and